Good evening, Hanya Yanagihara. It is a great pleasure and an honor to have you with us in Amsterdam. But most of all, thank you for writing this great novel, To Paradise. It is not only a gripping story, it also provides a quest, an adventure, a trip, a warm bath that turns very hot, a hot bath that turns icy and hot again. In Paradise consists of 3 parts. These 3 parts dish out 3 periods in time: 1893, 1993, and 2093. Mind you, these years are possibilities, parallel versions of our world. They are not ours, but still we can immediately relate to them. To understand To Paradise, one might think of the famous butterfly effect. That is, the flight of a butterfly in Brazil could lead to a tornado in Texas. Small decisions have large consequences. Remember the film Back to the Future? The biggest problem of that lovely hero Marty McFly, being in the past, is that he risks erasing himself in the future because of one small, well-intended piece of advice that he gives out of the goodness of his heart. That is the way one can read these 3 versions of an alternate world history that Hanya Yanagihara describes in 3 separate books. The miracle is that these 3 books, 3 novels, evolve into this one great book, To Paradise. The 3 novels depict 3 different worlds, but yet they are linked by names. In each of the 3 parts, Ms. Yanagihara showers the same names on different characters. David, Charles, Edward, and others. Every time they are utterly different people. They aren't even versions of one another. But their names seem to suggest that they are related in a magical, mysterious way. What's in a name? Nothing, everything, whatever. What's in a name turns out to be a serious question. The characters tend to be all male, and suddenly there's one woman. Her name is Charlie. She turns out to be the most interesting person in this great book, the character into whom all the others seem to dissolve. To me, that is. Any other reader can and will have other interpretations, because, like all rich pieces of art, To Paradise imposes a personal relationship on its reader. I can sit next to you, I can walk hand in hand with you, and yet we will feel differently about these characters, as we will value differently the situations we find them in contrary ways. We live in the age of COVID-19. Vaccination keeps it at bay, but only after 2 years in its grip we know it has sunk its jaws in our throats and refuses to let go. We now all say we have to live with it, and we will learn to do so. Only 2 years ago, it was unfathomable that we would ever consider this fate. We would conquer it, and that was that. And now To Paradise has come out. It stunned its readers. Here was a writer who based her novel on this virus, and she wrote her book before it even attacked us. She seemed to predict our fate, including alarmingly true details and a range of chilling possible consequences of the pandemic. And now, since February 23, there's more. Now a war has broken out on the edge of Western Europe. Russia's President Putin viciously tries to overrun Ukraine for reasons that can only be labeled fake news. And what is the other pillar to paradise besides this all too real ongoing pandemic? The effect of a world war, including a reshaped world order. We do not know when this war will end, let alone how. We don't know yet if it can be contained or if it will turn out to be World War III. But we can be sure that balances of power will be shifted. They already have. The strange truth is, in her novel, To Paradise, Hanya Yanagihara not only supposes the all-too-real outcome of a pandemic, she also takes an advance on a post-war future, and it doesn't look good. The only comfort is that she does not predict, far from it. She suggests possibilities. We still have a way out. Reading To Paradise once more proved to me that a work of art, be it a play, a painting, a piece of music or a novel, can evolve into a being in itself. It lives, it moves. It can touch you in unexpected ways and force you in strange directions. Reading To Paradise shocked me. It rocked my life. Certitudes no longer exist. Love exists, but can lead to disaster. I read, I enjoyed, I cherished. I got upset. I grew so sad. I experienced the proverbial loneliness of a long-distance runner, the long distance being life. That is what Hanya Yanagihara did to me, and now I can do nothing else but thank her for that. I'd love to welcome Hanya Yanagihara on the stage.
This is very...
Are you comfortable? Deep. Do they work? Yeah.
Is this working? All right,
yeah.
Okay. Joyce, thank you so much for, I kind of feel that I should leave while I'm ahead because I don't think the evening can get better than that beautiful introduction.
No, thank you.
Thank you so much. It was really an honor. And thank you to the John Adams Institute and to my publishers and to my translators who I haven't had a chance to say hello to, and to the Dutch readers. I mean, one of the ongoing mysteries of A Little Life, I have to say, is why it performs so well here. And there's lots of theories. You know, someone always says, well, you know, someone will inevitably say, because it did very well in Poland, and someone will say, well, it's a Catholic country, but that doesn't apply here. So if any of you have theories, maybe Joyce, you have a theory we can talk about later, but I'd be very interested to hear them. And it might just be luck. Maybe I just got lucky here, but whatever the reason, I'm very grateful to you. New Amsterdam has been my publisher from the start of my career when no one bought my books, and to have your support and your enthusiasm has been the great gift, the great unexpected gift of my life. So thank you.
Thank you. Oh yeah, thank you. I should do that. Thank you so much, Hanya. I forgot.
No disasters yet.
Well, I had one question in the speech, and that I want to pose it now. Yeah. What's in a name?
Well, so as you mentioned, the characters all have the same names, or variations of the same 3 or 4 names. And I suppose, you know, there are a couple of things. The most literal answer is that I think we always think of ourselves as individuals shaping society. And one of the questions that I hope this book asks is, what if it's the opposite? What if society is actually shaping us? So, you know, we're Joyces and Hanyas and Tracys, and the world is having its effect on us rather than us having our effect on it. It almost makes us, it almost, I hope, minimizes the individual and the arc of history rather than the other way around. The other thing that that I wanted this book to be is a very personal, in a way, memoir of my experiences in my America. And one of the thrilling and fractious things about America is that it is 280 million different versions of the country. And I think every country can say this. But in America, it feels particularly vivid because you can live next door to somebody whose idea, whose reckoning of the country, of its history, of what it stands for, can be completely different.
Yeah.
So if you grew up in my sort of America, for example, you will see different things in this book. And if you didn't, or if you weren't American at all, you won't see them, and it shouldn't make a difference. But the last names of the four characters, Bishop, Bingham, Cook, and Griffith, are the last names of great missionary families who came from America to the island, the kingdom of Hawaii, in the 19th century, and many of them intermarried the royal family and were later responsible for the overthrow of the kingdom.
And are they famous in America or in Hawaii? Are they famous?
They're
names?
famous in Hawaii. If you are from Hawaii, is anyone here from Hawaii, by the way? I always have to ask. No, but there's always one or two people. If you're from Hawaii, you'll instantly know, who
them.
they are.
Yeah.
Yes.
And to me, especially Bingham sounded so 19th century.
Yes. I mean, the Bingham family, there is, in the second part of the book, one of the characters says there's a Bingham Hall at Yale University that I walked past, and there is a Bingham Hall at Yale University named for Hiram Bingham, who was the first Westerner to encounter Machu Picchu and was a descendant of those Hawaii missionaries.
Yeah. And there's one named David, and of course David suggests Goliath. And to me, the David in every story is kind of the engine for whatever happens.
You know, that's very interesting. I never, I did not grow up in a Christian tradition, so I did not grow up with the idea of paradise. I did not grow up on biblical stories. So I like that interpretation. It wasn't intentional. I was thinking more of King David Kalakaua, who was one of Hawaii's last kings and who's referred to in the second part of the book, who is known by his Hawaiian name, Kavika. And so it's not necessarily that the characters' names are significant, but that the triangle they represent, that there is always someone who needs caring, there's always someone who provides that care, and there's always somebody who, in a sense, disrupts that relationship. It's more the chemistry of the relationship of these characters to one another rather than their names being actually representative of anything in history. Having said that, it's a great concept and I might take that.
You're welcome.
Writers steal all the time, right?
So when this is the question, what's in the name, but obviously the next question has to be what's in the title. So the title is To Paradise, but the three books that the book consists of end with To Paradise, one after another and in several ways. So to me, the first book ends with To Paradise, to a new, possibly new life. The second, To Paradise, back to lost roots. And the third is the person, Charlie, who says it. She thinks it's to freedom and safety. But, well, we shouldn't spoil this, but maybe not. So, what's the title? Which interpretation of To Paradise suggests the title?
Well, the first thing is, who's read it? Okay, so Joyce was saying that we should just cruelly tell you the ending of everything, but we won't.
Because I don't think that books or films or whatever depend on
yes, I agree. That is true. But we won't be cruel that way. Well, first I'll sort of back into the answer and I'll say that, in America typically, I mean, first of all, the idea of paradise is a walled garden. It is meant to keep people out. and not allow people in. And so one of the things I started thinking about was the central mythology of America, which is that America is a paradise for everybody. And of course, paradise, by its very definition, cannot be for everybody. And yet, the metaphor, which is so imperfect, the problem with it is that it is perfect enough. Because for many people whose ancestors chose to come to the country, including my own, America was a kind of paradise and is a kind of paradise, much more than the places they were leaving. And so I started thinking about the very American idea of paradise. First of all, it's always the West. Typically in America, paradise has meant the West. You go farther and farther and farther. You went to California, then you fell off the country, and then you went to Hawaii. But paradise is also, in America, something within. And it is this suggestion that happiness, not contentment, but bliss, is something that you can achieve if you believe hard enough, or you work hard enough, or you try hard enough. And it is a very punishing belief, because it suggests that if you are somehow incapable of finding happiness, it is your fault. And I think that's a very dangerous way for us to teach our children how to think about what they should want in life and what the idea of happiness is. That it is something that is purely dependent upon their ability to achieve it. But in this book, you were talking about the ending. Each section of the book ends with to paradise. And each section is unfinished in a way, or it suggests it is not definitive. And when I was writing this book, I began writing in earnest in early 2018, and I finished at the very end of 2020, so it was 3 years. And I felt very much in that period, and I think many Americans felt this way, and not just Americans, that you were seeing the country change in real time. That it was one of those moments in history that you were seeing, you understood that you would, in retrospect, you would later see it from the distance of history as a moment in which the paradigm truly shifted. And there was this real time sense that you didn't know what the country was becoming. And
that's because of the election of Donald Trump, I suppose.
And not only that, but that it had culminated in the election of Donald Trump, but that you didn't know what America's conclusion would be, that our future very much seemed and seems uncertain, and that same sense of uncertainty, of wariness, of fear, I think is something, but also of hope and endurance is what I think I wanted to imply with the endings of the three sections.
So, to me, to paradise also suggests death. You die and then you go to paradise.
Yes, although, as I said, I did not grow up in a religious or cultural tradition that believed in paradise. My father was sort of nominally Buddhist, but he did not believe, he was not of a sect that believed in the idea of nirvana or transcendence. He belonged to a very ascetic sect where they kind of just want you to just die and get it out of the way. But, because living is kind of besides the point. But so I didn't grow up with that idea of paradise, either literally or figuratively.
So that's once again, like I said, when you read something.
It's a good theory, though. Yes, I like it.
You just say, "This book is mine, and I will give my interpretation."
But it is. But the idea of paradise exists in almost every major, religious tradition, of course. Yeah.
So this book consists of 3 books. How did it go about? How did it come? What state of mind were you in that you started a huge work like this?
The ideas arrived together, and they seemed inseparable from one another, but it took me some time to figure out how they were speaking to one another, how they were related. With the first book, which is set in 1893, first I had always wanted to write a marriage novel, which is a kind of, a literary subgenre that exists in every culture around the world. And a marriage, Austen and, a marriage novel. And all marriage novels are about money, ultimately. Yeah. And, all novels are about money. It's a very postmodern idea to think that the novel is inseparable from money. Because, Tolstoy knew it, Austen knew it, Dickens knew it. I mean, I'm only naming a few people from a few places, but all of them knew that the characters' motivations, their possibilities, their worlds were ultimately defined by how much money they had. And if you were a woman, it was not, well, your possibilities in life were directly affected by how much money you had or how much money you could marry into. And so I started thinking, what if I could write a marriage novel, a 19th century marriage novel that wasn't gendered in that way, where the idea of money itself was not gendered. Yeah. And then also, could I write a version of America that had not been founded on Puritanism? And, you know, Puritanism in the United States is, I think, in many ways similar to Calvinism here. And it's a quite punishing form of Christianity. And if you change that, then the idea of love would change, the idea of gender would change, the idea of race would not change. But that was the beginning of that book. But the three sections arrived very much at the same time, as I said, and I knew they had something to do with one another, but I couldn't figure out how or why or what.
And then you started writing 3 books together, split screen experience?
Yes, no, I knew what it was going to be. I knew the last lines of every section. I knew how each section would end. And I think for any of you who are writers, the writing begins when you know that. When you know that, before you even begin the physical act of, you know, putting fingers to keyboard, once you know that, you know the book. And so I wrote chronologically. I wrote the first section, 1893, and then I wrote the first part of the second section, 1993, and then I wrote the third section, 2093, and then I doubled back and wrote the second section of 1993. Yeah.
And why 93?
Well, the book begins in 1893 because that was the year that, well, a few things. The book begins in 1893 because that was the year that the last queen of Hawaii was overthrown by a group of American missionaries and businessmen, and the country was annexed 5 years later by the Americans. And I wanted to write, you know, an end-of-century novel, a fantasiac novel, and because at the end of centuries, it is natural for us as humans to feel uncertain. It means a redefinition of what history is. It's a very retrospective moment, and so I wanted these 3 books separated by 100 years, by the sort of active years of the American experiment. And I like organization in my books. I think I'm very good at structure, and I'm good at sort of mirroring, by which I mean that, you know, that there's a detail in the first that should reappear in the last, and I wanted it to feel mathematical in a way.
And did you ever get confused by yourself?
No. They were such distinct worlds, and world building is great fun. And it just has to make logical sense within the world you create.
And the 3 books seem to have their own styles, literary styles. So the first book is based on the style of Henry James that you already told. It is a construction like a novel of Henry James with the same title. And the other 2, what styles were they?
Well, I wanted to write more of a modern novel in section 2, so it begins, the first part of that section unfolds over the course of a single night and is told in the third person, and then it moves into the first person narrative, which again is a very, you know, kind of not a modern invention, but a style we associate with modernity. And then the third part is told in an old-fashioned form, in alternating voices, one of which is a young woman talking to someone we don't know, maybe to herself, and the second part is a series of letters again. Yes. I love epistolary novels.
Yeah. Oh yes, which ones do you love?
I love Richardson. I think that there's, for example, Samuel Richardson's books, and I think there's a reason the epistolary novel has endured, because the form is so intimate, but it's also performative. And, when I was in college, email was just becoming popularized. And so back in the day, you had to pay to make long-distance calls. And so it was much cheaper to write emails back and forth, to my friends in Boston or on the West Coast. And you can kind of tell this is what really ages you more than anything else. You can tell who treats emails like letters, and I'm old enough so that I do.
But you're the one, yeah.
Yeah.
I think we should instruct children to write letters. I mean,
well, they're very, so every night I write a very long letter to my best friend, and he writes one back, a long email, and he writes back. And for writers, it's very good practice. I mean, the letter is intimate, as I said. It's performative. You're aware that you're writing it for someone to enjoy. You're also aware that you're writing it for posterity to some extent. They're journalistic in a way. I mean, insofar as they're reporting about things that happened in your day and around the world. And they're very satisfying documents to write and very satisfying documents to read.
And also, isn't it like that you, when writing a letter, you give more intimate details?
Yes,
I mean, when I
so.
speak, I keep my teeth behind my tongue behind my teeth, but writing.
Yes, and you can say things that you wouldn't, you can say things in an email or a letter that you wouldn't say to someone's face or on the phone.
And in the third part of your book, it seems that the person who is writing the letters is telling it to himself also, what's happening to him.
Yes, I mean, I think it's a way, one of the human instincts is to narrativize our own lives, and he definitely is doing that.
So he can understand him.
Yes,
what's
he
happening
can understand
to him.
himself to himself, yeah.
The biggest variation on actual reality of the three books to me is that the blood ties are no longer important or of consequence. People marry, but marriages are arranged. Is that a thought experiment that you like, or is it something you think is important, or why?
Well, I mean, one of the things that's always puzzled me is, after so many thousands of years of human civilization, why the idea of family has remained relatively narrow and rigid. And maybe it's our evolutionary tendencies to form a tradition, what is known as a traditional family. But in the coming world, that might not be true. I mean, a family, the realization of a family depends on a society that allows it to exist, and it also depends on a certain amount of resources, and it depends upon the desire to procreate. We may no longer, but maybe it's ultimately based on resources, and that model may not be useful for in the distant future. But a friend of mine said, which I've appropriated as my own, he said that this book was very much about challenge the idea of what a parent was. Yeah. That maybe at the end of the day, a parent was an older person taking care of a younger person. And sometimes that older person was a literal parent, sometimes it was a boss, sometimes it was a grandparent, sometimes it was a lover. But as we enter in these three worlds, traditional family members are in shorter supply for various reasons. And so people have to make their own unions, and they do so with what they have available to them.
In A Little Life, it was all the same, that the friends were substitutes for family. So, but don't you believe at all in blood ties?
Well, I mean, I think it's a very useful social construct. No, I mean, but this is what I mean. There's a reason it's endured. It has not been relevant in my life. It's not been potent in my life.
But not with your parents either?
Yes, I mean, I love them very much, but but the idea that they are more important to me than anybody else, that they are paramount in my loyalties and affection, is not true. And they never encouraged me to think that way either.
No, I keep asking this because I remember the moment my daughter was born, and I saw the child and I thought, if one person puts out one finger to her, I will bite it off. I mean, I have never had thoughts like that.
Yes, but I think for those of us who are not a member of a family defined by blood or law, the idea of loyalties and affection and duty become different.
Okay, I see Maarten Heijmans has arrived.
Hi, Maarten.
Welcome. So we have a little intermezzo now, where Maarten is reading to us a small part of book 3, I think. A Letter to Peter by Charles, isn't it? So please, thank you.
Oh, but
It's
okay, so this, Martin is going to read a letter that Charles, who is the scientist in book 3, is writing to his friend Peter, who is his correspondent throughout the course of the book. And he's writing about a fable that his mother told him, his grandmother told him, that is somewhat of a metaphor for the state that the country is in at the moment.
Thank you. Good evening. I've been invited to read for all of you because I did the Dutch audiobook version of the wonderful To Paradise. I read it in Dutch, so I'm going to read it in English now. Please forgive any mistakes I might make. July 12th, 2084. Dear Peter, last night I dreamt of Hawaii. The night before, I had been in my favorite house of ill repute, sleeping alongside A, when the sirens began to wail. Jesus, Jesus, said A, scrabbling for his clothes, his shoes. It's a raid. Men began crowding in doorways, buttoning their shirts and buckling their belts as they did, their faces blank or terrified. It was safer to be silent in these raids, and yet someone, a young man who does something injustice, kept repeating, "What we're doing isn't illegal. What we're doing isn't illegal," until someone else hissed at him to shut up, that we already knew that. We stood there, waiting, about 30 of us across 4 floors. Whoever they were trying to find wasn't guilty of homosexuality. The person might be under suspicion for smuggling or forgery or theft. And although they couldn't charge us for who we are, they could humiliate us for it. Why else then would they arrest this person when they knew he was here instead of quietly at his residence? It was for the spectacle of leading us single file out of the house, our hands raised above our heads like criminals, for the mortifying pleasure of tying our hands and having us kneel on the curb, for the sadism of asking us to repeat our names. "Louder, please, I didn't hear you," and shouting it to their colleague to run through the database. "Charles Griffith, 13 Washington Square North, says he's a scientist at RU, age 80 in October," and then a smirk. 80? You're still doing this at 80? As if it were absurd, obscene that someone so old should still want to be touched, when really it is the sensation you come to crave the most. And then there were the discomfort of the hours spent in a crouch in the street, your head bent as if in shame, the suspect long since removed, waiting for the theater to end, for one of them to get bored and release us, the sound of his fellow soldiers' laughter as they climbed back into their cars. They were never physically abusive with us. They never called us names. They couldn't. Too many of us had too much power. But it was clear they disdained us. And when we finally stood and turned for the house, you could see the street darkening again. The neighbors who had watched us through their windows, never saying a word, returning to bed now that the show had concluded. Returning to bed now that the show had concluded. I wish they'd just make us illegal. Someone, a young man, had grumbled after the last raid. And a number of people had begun shouting at him, asking him how he could be so ignorant and stupid. But I understood what he was trying to express. If we were illegal, we would know our position. As it was, we were nothing. We were known, but not named, tolerated, but not recognized. We lived in a constant state of uncertainty, waiting for the day we would be declared enemies, waiting for the night when what we did would, in the space of an hour, a single signed document, be transformed from regrettable to criminal. The very word for what we were had somehow at this point disappeared from the vernacular. To us, we were only people like us. Do you know Charles? He's one of us. Even we had become euphemistic, unable to say what we are. They almost never rated the inside. As I said, too many of us had too much power. And it was like they knew that the amount of contraband they'd find inside would entail so much processing that they'd be able to do little else for the following week. But there were chutes in each room that you could toss your possessions down. And the first place we went after going back indoors was the safe box in the basement, where we'd retrieve our books and wallets and devices and whatever else we had dropped. And then we would leave, probably without even saying goodbye to the person we'd been with. And the next time we came, neither of us would mention it. We would pretend it had never happened. 2 nights ago, we had been waiting 3 minutes for the bang on the door, for the loudspeaker announcing one of our names, when we realized that the sirens weren't for us after all. Again, there was a soundless exchange of glances. The people on the first and second floors looking up to us on the third and fourth, all of us wondering. When finally, a young man on the first floor cautiously unlocked the door, and then, after a pause, dramatically flung it open, standing in the center of the frame. He shouted, and we came rushing downstairs to see the bank street had become a river, the water racing east. "The Hudson River's flooded," I heard someone say in a quiet, awestruck voice. And then, right after, someone else said, "The safe box." And there was a hustle down to the basement, which was already filling with water. A chain was formed to move the books and equipment we'd stored there to the attic. And after, we stood at the first floor windows, watching the water rise. A had a communication device, a kind I had never seen before, one different from my own. I never asked what he did, and he never told me. And he spoke into it, a few terse words, and 10 minutes later, a flotilla of plastic dinghies appeared. "Get out," said A, whom I had known only to be passive and somewhat whiny, but who had suddenly transformed into someone declarative and stern, his work persona, I assumed. "Everyone queue up for the boats." The water was now lapping up the front steps. "What about the house?" someone asked. And we all knew he was asking about the books in the attic. "I'll handle them," said a youngish man whom I had never met, but who I knew to be the house's owner or manager or keeper. It was never clear which, but I knew he was responsible. "Go." So we did. This time, whether because of who A was or because of the equalizing nature of the crisis, there were no jokes from the soldiers, no sneers. They held out their hands, and we grabbed them, and were lowered into the rafts. And the whole exchange was so matter-of-fact, so collegial. We needed saving, and they were here to save us. That you could almost believe that their disgust for us was an act, that they respected us as much as they did anyone. Behind us, Another fleet of boats was arriving, and now there was a loudspeaker announcement. Residents of Zone 8, evacuate your units, descend to your front doors and wait for help. By now, the water was rising so rapidly that the boat was actually bobbing on the water, as if atop a wave, and the puny motor was becoming choked with leaves and twigs. A block east, on Greenwich Street, we were joined by other motorized rafts moving east, from Jane and West 12th Street, all of us making our slow way to Hudson Street, where corps of soldiers were stacking sandbags, trying to hold the river back. Here there were emergency vehicles and ambulances, but I climbed out of the raft and left, walking east, never looking behind me. It was best not to get involved where you didn't need to. There was no honor, no use in it. I hadn't gotten too wet, but my socks squished as I walked, and I was glad I hadn't worn my cooling suit despite the heat. At West 10th and 6th Avenue, a platoon of soldiers jogged by me, groups of 4, each holding aloft a plastic raft. They looked weary, I thought, and why wouldn't they be? 2 months ago, the fires. Last month, the rains. This month, the floods. When I finally got home, everything was quiet, though whether that was because of the hour or because some of the inhabitants had been conscripted to help with the efforts, I didn't know. The next day, Tuesday, yesterday, I went to work and did little but listen to radio reports of the flood, which had consumed a significant part of Zone 8 and all of Zone 7 and 21, from what had been the highway all the way east to, in some instances, Hudson Street. The Bank Street house had presumably been ruined. Someone will let me know for sure one way or the other. 2 people had died. An elderly lady had fallen down the stairs of her house on West 11th Street trying to reach the boat and had broken her neck. A man on Perry Street had refused to vacate his basement apartment and had drowned. 2 streets had been somewhat spared, purely from happenstance. The army had felled 3 massive deceased trees on Bethune and Washington early Monday morning, which had mitigated the flooding there. And on Gansevoort, the army had been digging a trench on Greenwich to reroute a deteriorating sanitation pipe, and this too had minimized the damage. Whereas a few years ago, I would have been outraged by the flood, its inevitability, the result of years of governmental inaction and arrogance, I found that this time I could summon little of anything. Indeed, I felt nothing but a kind of weariness, and even that I experienced not as a sensation, but as an absence of one. I listened to the radio and yawned, staring out of my office window at the East River, which David had always said looked like chocolate milk, watching a small vessel inch its way north, maybe to David's Island, maybe not. But if I could not find it in myself to feel anything about the flood, there would be others who would. The protesters who gathered each day in the square and were removed each night. I had expected a surfeit of them when I returned home. They had long ago discovered who among us were on the committee, and they had an unerring sense of when we'd arrive home each night. It didn't matter how often we changed drivers or how much we tried to append our schedules. The car would approach home, and there they'd be, with their signs and slogans. They're allowed to do this. They cannot congregate outside state buildings, but they can outside of ours, which I suppose is more apt. It's the architects they hate even more than what we've built. Last evening, though, There was no one, just the square with its vendors and people shopping its stalls. This meant that the floods had given the state a reason to conduct a roundup of the protesters. And for a moment, I dawdled in the street despite the heat, watching regular people doing regular things before going into the house and up to the apartment. That night, I dreamed of when I was a teenager at my grandparents' farm in La Ie. It was the year of the first tsunami, and although we had been just far enough inland to not be directly hit, they had always said that they wished we had been, for then we could have collected the insurance money and begun anew, or not at all. As it was, the farm was too intact to be forsaken, but also too damaged ever to be productive again. The hill that had provided shade for my grandmother's herb garden had been destroyed, and the irrigation channels were filled with seawater. You would pump it away, and then it would return for months. Salt had affixed itself to every surface. The trees, the animals, the vegetables, the sides of the house were all streaky with white. The salt made the air sticky, and when the trees fruited that spring, the mangoes, the lychees, the papayas all tasted of salt. They had never been happy people, my grandparents. They had bought the farm in a rare romantic moment, but romance is ephemeral. Yet they kept working at it long past the point when it ceased to be enjoyable, partly because they were too proud to admit they'd failed, and partly because they had limited imaginations and couldn't think of what else they might want to do. They had wanted to live as their own grandparents had. They had wanted to live as their own grandparents had dreamed of living before Restoration, and yet doing anything because your ancestors wanted to do it, fulfilling someone else's ambition, is a poor motivation. They had berated my mother for not being Hawaiian enough, and then she left, and they had to raise me. They had berated me for not being Hawaiian enough too, while at the same time assuring me I never would be. And yet, when I left as well, for why would I stay someplace I had been told that I would never belong, they resented that just as much. But the dream was not so much about them as it was a story my grandmother had told me when I was a child, about a hungry lizard. All day the lizard would stalk across the land, grazing. He ate fruit and grass, insects and fish. When the moon rose, the lizard would go to sleep and dream of eating. Then the moon would set, and the lizard would wake and begin eating again. The lizard's curse was that he would never be full, although the lizard didn't know this was a curse. He wasn't that intelligent. One day, after many thousands of years had passed, the lizard woke as usual and began looking for food as usual. But something was wrong. Then the lizard realized there was nothing left for him to eat. There were no more plants, no more birds, no more grasses or flowers or flies. He had eaten everything. He had eaten the stones, the mountains, the sand, and the soil. Here my grandmother would sing a lyric from an old Hawaiian protest song, and I'm probably pronouncing this wrong. Ua lava maku ika pohaku, ika ai kamaho o oka aina. All that was left was a thin layer of ash, and beneath the ash, the lizard knew, was the core of the earth, which was fire. And although the lizard could eat many things, he could not eat that. So the lizard did the only thing he could. He lay in the sun and waited, dozing and saving his strength. And that night, as the moon was rising, he drew himself up on his tail and swallowed the moon. For a moment, he felt wonderful. He'd had no water all day, and the moon was so cool and smooth in his stomach, as if he'd swallowed an enormous egg. But as he was relishing the feeling, something changed. The moon was still rising, trying to escape him so it could continue its path in the sky. This must not happen, the lizard thought, and he quickly dug a hole, narrow but deep, or as deep as he could before he reached the fire at the Earth's center, and stuck his entire snout inside of it. This will keep the moon going. This will keep the moon from going anywhere, he thought. But he was wrong. For just as it was the lizard's nature to eat, it was the moon's nature to rise. And no matter how tightly the lizard clamped its mouth, the moon rose still. But so tight was the hole in the earth where the lizard had stuck its snout that the moon was unable to exit his mouth. And so the lizard exploded. And the moon burst forth from the earth and continued its path. For many thousands of years after that, nothing happened. Well, I say nothing happened, but in those years, everything that the lizard had eaten returned. Back came the stones and the soil. Back came the grasses and the flowers and the plants and the trees. Back came the birds and the insects and the fish and the lakes. Overseeing it all was the moon, which rose and sank each night. That was the end of the story. I had always assumed it was a Hawaiian folktale, but it wasn't. And when I asked her who had told her that fable, she would say, my grandmother. When I was in college and taking an ethnography class, I asked her to write it down for me. She scoffed. Why, she asked. You already know it. Yes, I told her, but it was important for me to hear it as she would tell it, not as I remembered it. But she never did, and I was too proud to ask her again, and then the class ended. Then, several years later, we were barely communicating then, pulled apart by mutual lack of interest and disappointment. She sent me an email, and in the email was the story. This was during my wanderjaar, and I remember getting it while I was at a cafe in Kamakura with friends, although it wasn't until the next week, when I was on Jeju, that I read it. There it was, the familiar old inexplicable story, just as I'd remembered it. The lizard died, as he always did. The earth restored itself, as it always did. The moon glowed in the sky, as it always would. But this time there was a difference. After everything had grown back, my grandmother wrote, the lizard returned. Although this time he was not a lizard, but himea heliku, a thing that goes upright. And this creature behaved in exactly the same way as his long-deceased ancestor had. He ate and ate and ate, until one day he looked about him and realized there was nothing left, and he too was forced to swallow the moon. You know, of course, what I'm thinking. For a long time, I assumed that it would be a virus that would destroy us all in the end. That humans would be felled by something both greater and much smaller than ourselves. Now I realize that that is not the case. We are the lizard, but we are also the moon. Some of us will die, but others of us will keep doing what we always have, continuing on our own oblivious way, doing what our nature compels us to do, silent and unknowable and unstoppable in our rhythms. Love, Charles.
Martin, that was amazing. It's like you're an actor or something, you know? It was really, really brilliant. Thank you so much. Wow, the line that Martin actually did fairly well in reciting in Hawaiian is from an old Hawaiian protest song written when the Queen was being overthrown. And it's called the Stone Eating Song because there's a famous line in it that says, they're talking about turning down the Americans' money, and it translates to, we would rather eat stones, the wondrous food of our land, than accept money from the Americans. Anyway, thank you, that was really amazing. Wow.
Thank you. About this fable or parable that consists the main part of this letter, where does it come from? Did you invent it, or is it a series?
The fable, I invented it, yeah.
Because it sounds ancient.
Well, I love writing origin stories, and I'm very interested in countries' various origin stories, because they're so, and I think this is a good lesson for all writers, they don't get hung up on what's probable or what's logical or what's possible. They are written purely for the wonder of the story. And I always like to hear which stories very old people tell about themselves, old cultures tell about themselves, about how they came to exist and how they've come to make sense of who they are.
Well, you fooled me. I thought now we get a story of the grandmother. We have 2 microphones, so maybe someone wants to ask a question. Now you have the chance.
I've planted someone in the audience. If no one, there he is.
Could you please go to the microphone?
Hi, Hanya. Oh, is this on? Hello?
Yeah,
Hi.
it works.
Hi. Okay, I have a kind of a superficial question to start with. You have told me this once before, and I think it's quite interesting for everyone to know. I think your book, A Little Life, has one of the best covers ever of a book. And I wanted to know if you have a story about the cover of To Paradise. So I'm talking about the image that you used, the colors of the font, everything.
Thank you for that good question. From someone who knows about color. It's the painter is named, I'm not going to pronounce his name correctly, but Hubert Voss, and he's a Dutch painter who they believe he painted this in 1898. Someone will tell 1895 maybe, but at any rate, he painted it. He was mostly known as a painter of objects, of still lifes, and he also painted portraiture. And is probably his best-known portrait, and I don't even know where it is, maybe it's in the museum here, he was the last Westerner to paint Empress Dowager Cixi. And his second or third wife was a woman who was part Hawaiian, Chinese, and American. And so that's how he came to Hawaii. And unlike many artists of his time, he did not particularly exoticize his subjects. And I knew of his work because there was a painting of his of a Hawaiian cowboy hanging in the Honolulu Museum of Art. So when we started to look for covers for this book, I knew I wanted something that felt out of time, that felt timeless. And I looked to see if he had anything, and he did. He had a painting of this boy named Iokepa, a Hawaiian fisher boy. And I love the expression in his eyes. It's almost like he's looking into the future and doesn't like what he sees. It's so wary, and it was the expression in his face that made the painting seem modern. And so the background was brown, and we changed it to black to make it look like he was emerging from shadows. But the other meaningful thing is, because Voss was probably painting this directly between the Queen's overthrow and her annexation, it also would have been a very frightening time for the Queen's people. That wariness in his eyes, which I imagine him looking into the future and seeing, could have also meant that he was looking to the future of Hawaii and not liking what he saw either. And it felt in a different, perhaps less immediate way than the Peter Hujar photo on the cover of A Little Life. It felt as if the expression and the intimacy and the emotion of the painting was doing a lot of work at telegraphing the themes of the book itself. And then I, you know, as I told you, I really picked the neon Pantone, which is my great triumph and contribution to that cover too.
Someone else with a question.
Don't be shy, you know, because the Brussels audience had a lot of questions.
So,
and
are we having this, that we are less than the Brussels?
yes, and they said that the Dutch were more confident, so you're proving them wrong. I'm sure they'll be excited to hear. Oh, that got someone to raise their hand. Oh.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay, so this might be like a weird question that you have gotten before. So, are you nervous that, like, after the great worldwide success that was A Little Life, that your writing will always get compared to it and that you might not feel that it's good enough or anything for other audiences?
No. I mean, you know, no, and I don't mean that in an arrogant way, but, you know, I was talking to the American writer Michael Cunningham, whose work I really love, and wrote a very big transformative novel in the middle of his career called The Hours, which I'm sure some of you know. And after that book, he wrote a book called Specimen Days, which this book is really in conversation with, and is my favorite of his books. And it's very strange, and it's not beloved in the same way. And he said, you just have to do what you want in the end. And I think for a few things, I mean, a few reasons. I think you should always challenge yourself to do something difficult and frightening and ambitious with each artistic project. Second, I think if you try to repeat what you did, the reader knows it and gets suspicious, and the entire project begins to seem cynical. You know, I'm perfectly at peace with the fact that A Little Life was such an inexplicable and unrepeatable one-off that it was just such, the alchemy of how that book reached so many people is not something I can explain. It's not something the publishers can explain, because if they could explain it, they would do it for every book. So I'm perfectly at peace knowing that it is, you know, not only highly unlikely, but almost certain that I'll never experience another publishing moment like that one. So I think the only, you know, if you're a writer yourself or an artist, I mean, the only thing you have to do is make something that feels challenging and difficult and satisfying, and that's it.
Okay, and also, since we're talking about To Paradise, so imagine like a TV show or a movie would be made about it. Who would be like someone that you would say, I love this person to play this character?
Well, you know, it's interesting you should mention that. So the book has been rejected by 45 networks, streaming services, and studios in the United. Have you read it?
A Little Life and To Paradise.
Okay, so you'll understand this. So there was one network who was interested, and it was HBO, and I met with them and they said, well, what would you do with it? And I said, well, I would either take part one and I would make it an anthology series, and each you know, season would follow someone, you know, in the Bingham circle. And they said, well, historical shows don't sell. And I said, well, what about Bridgerton? And they said, that's different. And then they said, what about the third part? And I said, well, you could do the third part, but I want the casting to be racially true. So Majid, another actor in this, has heard me kind of go on about this, but who's in this audience. But so I said, that means you need a Polynesian actor to play Charles, one of the protagonists, and you need a Polynesian actress to play Charlie. If you can't get a Hawaiian or Polynesian actor or actress, I would accept a Maori actress or actor. And they said, okay, well, what about The Rock for Charles? Now, Charles is a virologist who ages from about 45 to 80 in the course of the book. And no disrespect to The Rock. I mean, you know, I'm sure he's a great guy, but I'm not going to have The Rock play, you know, Charles. And that was their only idea. And so I'm pretty sure that that idea is dead in the water.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
A Little Life has been made into a play by Ivo van Hoven.
Yeah.
How did he get you to accept his way of viewing?
I didn't really have much of a say in the matter. I don't know if Martin and Majid, who are both members of ITA, thank you, have heard this story before. But so I got a call from Ivo's agent. And you know, Ivo is, if you're a theater nerd like I am, you know, it's a very exciting call to get. And so I met with him, and it was pretty clear. My agent said, if you do this, it's going to be his way, and you just have to sort of stay out of the way. So we had a conversation, and he had great ideas. I mean, you know, one of the reasons you go with him is because he has such a subversive sense of what the theater is and what it can be made to do. And we had some sort of, you know, arm wrestles about certain subjects.
Can you give an example?
Well, yes, I mean, I wanted the casting to be racially true, and he, you know, and he explained that wasn't possible for a number of reasons, and, you know, and that it's a different market here than in the US. In the US, you'd have to. But I had very little to do with it. He ran some ideas by me, some of which actually made it to the stage and some of which didn't. But, you know, for those of you, I assume many of you have seen the production here. You'll know it is really an astonishing production. And one of the things I love about it the most is how he really uses the stage and the possibilities of the theater. And I don't think that a work should move to another genre unless the person who's creating that new work is really going to use the medium as much as they can. So I mean, if those of you who have seen it, I mean, I thought some of the spectacular innovations were, I mean, there's a part where Ramzi Nasser playing Jude is in great pain and suddenly the house lights go to bright white. And there's another, and the actor playing Harold spends most of his time cooking or cleaning on stage. And so the sense of parenthood, of fatherhood, you know, of bleach and of stew follow him around the entire time. And I just thought activating a live space like that in a way that felt so immediate and visceral, I think that's only something he could have done. Yeah. Or something only he could have done.
And the first time you saw it, did you think, well, this is no longer mine?
The book is no longer mine. You know, the book is the reader's, and you know, in a way, I mean, my relationship to the book now is simply that I feel somewhat like it's a child who's gone off into the world and never calls, and that's fine. I mean, the book is the reader's, and your job as the author is to not disrupt the reader's relationship to it. You know, a reader has a very intense and very emotional and very intimate experience with a book in a way that, say, someone watching a play does not have, I think, because it is an individual experience. And so, as the book's author, you are not there to dispute or disrupt or in any way upset the reader's relationship with that book. It is theirs, and there's nothing you can do. And it's a joyful thing when there's nothing you can do. With the play, because it was easier because I understood it was Ivo's interpretation. Had I been more involved, I think it would have been a much more fraught process for me. Having said that, you know, I hope to meddle in future productions of it. Don't tell Ivo, Martin. On you too, Majid.
There's a question.
Good evening.
Hello.
I enjoyed reading your book tremendously. It was a bit difficult. I told my daughter, I finished the book, but it was hard work. And the hard work is that the characters are so real. I was so intrigued as to what the end would bring to them. It was really the beginning according to each end, there was a beginning to a new life. And you just said, well, the book has come to an end and it belongs to the reader, so I think I'll just have to fill in the future of these characters. But are you ever going to tell us about what you thought might happen to these people?
If you come to the signing line, I'll tell you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And there's someone else.
I actually have a related question.
Yes.
So you addressed this earlier when you talked about kind of resolution and how there's not really definitive resolutions in To Paradise.
Yeah.
And I find that to be in pretty stark contrast to A Little Life, which you do have pretty stark, at least for a lot of the character arcs, very definitive endings.
Yes, that's true.
And I think that this, I could be wrong, but I think is also speaking to the different themes of each book. And that, for me at least, when reading To Paradise, I felt like it put me in this position in like, I am now of this kind of, in the uncertainty of that character in the moment. And it seems like To Paradise is maybe more concerned with this change and transformation, whereas A Little Life was more about the inescapability of your past self. For example, I'm thinking in particular of the axiom of equality, x equals x equals x, you know? And so is that kind of what you were going for? Or would you maybe expand on that a little bit?
No, that's a very good theory that, again, I might steal, so thank you. I mean, you know, but this is what I mean. I mean, I think readers do see something in the book that you don't see and that the author doesn't see. You know, I always thought, I say that both books share a quality of being against history fundamentally, by which I mean A Little Life was very much, it was written to be out of time. It felt, I hope it felt timeless. You know, there was no historical dates, there was no historical events. It could have existed, I wanted it to feel like it existed in the permanent present. This book is against history in a different way. It takes history and it takes from it what it wants and you know, throws away the rest. And so again, it doesn't have a fealty to history. But I suppose I wanted A Little Life to feel like a closed circuit. You know, it should have felt, it should have had the emotional engagement, but also the conclusion, the certainty of conclusion that a fairy tale has. And fairy tales do not leave unclear endings. They are meant to teach a lesson. And although the book is not meant to teach a lesson, it is meant to exist in a universe of its own. Whereas this book, To Paradise, is very much supposed to be an inquiry into what it feels like to be in America in the present. And you know, there is that Buddhist saying that whenever you talk about the present, you're actually talking about the past. And when you talk about the future, you're actually talking about the present. And so this sort of present tenseness works in a different way in this book. And I wanted it to feel like history in this moment feels, like it's not written yet.
Oh yeah, that's, I have more questions, but I'll leave it.
Yeah.
Thank you, yeah, you nailed it.
Thank you so much.
Hi.
Hi.
So I just wanted to clarify, I haven't read this one yet, it's third on my to-read list, but I hear a lot of people drawing comparisons to A Little Life, but after hearing this discussion and then also hearing you talk about these stories about Hawaii, I'm seeing a lot of parallel to People in the Trees in terms of like white men entering or infesting island communities and also kind of false created family ties that aren't related to blood and also questionable narratives as well as questionable narrators. So I was wondering, was this story somehow connected in terms of like was the idea connected when you were writing that first book? And then like, did any of the research process translate as well as kind of like, I was wondering if there was any ties as well.
That's a great question. And thank you for reading The People in the Trees. I mean, maybe 5, 10 people read the book.
I wanted to stab someone
after
after
reading
reading
it.
Yeah.
You know, it's, yes, but The People in the Trees, you're absolutely right, was a book about Hawaii. It was an allegory about Hawaii and what happens when, you know, a country makes contact with the West, in that case, Hawaii. And this book is also about America's imperialist experiment. You know, if you didn't grow up on the west coast of of America, or you didn't grow up in Hawaii, I think you don't really know about America's kind of fit of Pacific, you know, colonization. And, you know, but it was relatively short-lived. But it is a part of American history that is simply not discussed, I think, that much, unless you are from the West or you're of Asian descent. And this book, you're right, is much more overtly a book about Hawaii, and specifically about the idea of Hawaii, a prelapsarian Hawaii, a Hawaii before contact, and the impossibility of returning to a state before contact or before colonization, but the enduring romance of it. You know, all Americans who came to the country on our own free will did so because they were leaving someplace and wanted something better. And all of their descendants, myself included, have a very gauzy and romantic idea of what it must have been like back in the day. And we are allowed to have that idea of the state we never knew, of a country we never saw, because we're in America. And that pull, I think that Americans are particularly susceptible to, of trying to recreate some country they left and some country they never even knew, is a persistent theme throughout American literature and life, too.
Am I allowed to ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
Okay. Also, just related, I know that I'm personally a big fan of, I studied classes in like anthropology and sociology and ethnography, as well as like ethnographic techniques. And I know in a lot of your books, like in People in the Trees, as well as in this one, you've mentioned how like people writing down their stories, as well as people kind of narrating their stories to future generations, plays a big role in your part. And I was wondering if that, like that study, that field of work, and also kind of also the racial reckoning as well in those fields of work, and because I'm thinking of like Margaret Mead in Samoa, and also how terrible nowadays her work holds up to this day. Is that something that you have taken classes in the past, or like is that something that is present in your work?
It's not something I've taken classes in. And I think one of the, you know, I'm not of Hawaiian blood myself, and so everyone who lives in Hawaii is living with the reminder of what happened to that culture and that country. At the same time, I think when you grow up in the Pacific, you have to become very aware of not romanticizing. You know, it's a different kind of discrimination to say that certain cultures are purer or more meaningful or richer. No culture is inherently, you know, more meaningful or richer or purer or better than any other. But it's easy to start thinking like that because one sees how much they've been destroyed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And in book 2, there are two people who try with a child with them to recreate the old ways, and it goes totally wrong.
Yes, yeah.
It's totally perverted.
Yes, and it's completely performative and very artificial, but I also didn't mean to mock it. I mean, I understand the irresistible pull of a culture you've never seen, and yet you mourn for all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's Little Life is about pain, real pain, physical pain. But I see a lot of mental violence in this book. Is that something you were busy with? Like,
no, not directly. I mean, you know, my German editor described the characters, the protagonists in each of the sections as the losers of history, by which he didn't mean that, I mean, they're all privileged people and they're all have access to a lot of resources, but they all feel out of step somehow with the society they're in and what they've been given. And that too, that sense that paradise, that salvation comes when one feels one belongs to one's society. And the kind of torture that can inflict upon someone is certainly one of the themes of the book.
okay.
I was wondering, given what you just said about taking what you want from history and leaving the rest, what motivated you to write this kind of alternative history with regards to queerness the way you did, given that there is a lot of wiggle room there? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, we couldn't understand the question.
I'm sorry.
I must say I couldn't understand. Could you repeat it, please?
With regards to taking from history what you want and leaving the rest, I was curious as to why you chose to write an alternative reality surrounding queerness in the way you did, because there is, of course, a lot of wiggle room in that area.
I think, well, first of all, obviously, people who would now be called queer have existed in every culture throughout history and throughout time. I think one of the questions that, if this book has been predictive of anything, one of the conversations I think it predicted was the one that we're having on a national scale in the country, and that regards American history. Who gets to write it, who gets to star in it, who gets to edit it, who gets remembered in it. And I think, at the magazine I edit, we ran a story a couple of years ago about queer artists who are actively writing queerness into history, whether it's someone like Sarah Waters, the novelist who wrote Tipping the Velvet and writes lesbian lives into, Edwardian Victorian England, or whether it's someone like the American playwright George C. Wolfe, whose play The Colored Museum does something similar. Or there's this wonderful artist whose name I can't remember, who takes Dust Bowl images from, from the WPA era in the Great Depression in America, and tweaks them a little so it looks like a lesbian, a completely lesbian town. But I suppose one of the things I'm always interested in, and this book is interested in, is the stories that we know about this country, about America, are only the stories that have been written down. And there are many, many different possibilities of what this country could have been. And all of us in America, because it's such a young country, I think are always asking, what if? What if this law hadn't been passed? What if that policy had been? What would this country be? And so to try to imagine a different kind of past for America, in which those stories, which have always existed but got to be told, I think is not only a fascinating exercise, but also something that the country is involved in real time right now.
Definitely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please.
Hello. Well,
Hi.
first of all, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I am a part of the queer community, and one thing I noticed in your first two books, because I'm currently still reading the third one, is when you're writing about gay relationships, a lot of the times they have to do with age differences, and it is something I recognize a lot around me and also in my own life. Is that something you just came up with, or what is the reason that you chose to write that specific type of relationships?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. When you write, after your third book, certain themes start to announce themselves to you that you don't know where they came from, and you don't know what they mean, and people ask you about them and you don't have a good explanation. But I do think that, among the gay men I know, there is a real rich tradition of intergenerational friendship and intergenerational relationship and relationships of all kinds. This idea that, first from a necessity and then for other reasons, people taught, you had to find adults who could offer some sort of example of how to live and how to be a person in the world. And when I look at the friends I have, there's many, specifically among gay men, but also among lesbians as well. There's many, and then now among my trans friends, there's many different. There's a constant series of kind of mentorship of teaching people who didn't have role models how to be, which I think is a really lovely and powerful and meaningful sort of legacy within the queer community. But it was not something that I consciously thought of when writing the book.
Thank you.
Thank you.
In the second book, the character David is much younger than his husband or his lover. Yeah, but to me, David is a very tragic figure, more or less a servant, a sex servant.
Oh, I didn't see him like that at all. I mean, I saw him as someone who was really in a loving relationship and was trying to figure out who he was. He's 25. 25-year-olds don't, I mean, sorry to any of you who are 25. 25-year-olds don't know anything. They really don't. I mean, it's great to be alive, but they don't know, for example, that their bodies are never going to be better than they are. They don't know that they're never going to have more energy than they do at that moment. They don't know that they're going to get up in the morning, nothing will have gone wrong. Like, they don't know to take pleasure in the bodies that they have. Some of them do, but you don't really know until you're older. But I think of David in the second part of the book as a very typical 25-year-old. You know, he's someone who needs a lot of love and has a lot of love, and is in, you know, and his age is intertwined with confusion that he feels about his race and about his class and about what he's lost. But he is really, and he has a very good boyfriend who loves him. And to me, that Charles, that second Charles in this book, is a really wonderful figure.
I don't know whose turn it is. Maybe yours.
Yeah, I think it's me. So first of all, Hanya, thank you so much for sharing your gifts with us. I'm sure everyone in this room appreciates every chance we get to revel in kind of the misery and suffering and the human pain of your books, which is very cathartic, but always a pleasurable experience. My question is more of an attempt to fish for book recommendations for you. You did drop a few names in this conversation, like Cunningham, and there's the first part, obviously, but also kind of elusively reads like Henry James, Washington Square, I'm assuming, and then the second one maybe like Kushner, so I'm thinking maybe you can give us more. And then the second question would be, for you as a reader and not as a writer, what are your top, well, no, that's a better way of saying it. Like what books, basically, if you had to recommend books to someone and would get very jealous if they didn't read them, what would they be? Outside of the list of which I think you gave Guardian at some point, which was The Untouchable, 7 Japanese Tales, and then The Remains of the Day. So I wonder if there's anything else.
Wow.
This is a large question.
Putting me on the spot here. So do you want book recommendations that relate to Paradise?
Yes, especially to parts 1 and 2, but also regardless of To Paradise.
Yeah, but
Right. Well, listen, I mean, the book is in conversation with Specimen Days, as I mentioned, by Michael Cunningham. It's also, it really is, I later realized, in conversation with Angels in America by Tony Kushner, Washington Square, of course, and that's probably it. But I'm trying to think of something that feels sort of tonally. I mean, listen, I really love After Nightfall, which is also by Michael Cunningham, and it feels probably most like the second part. I have to ask really quickly, do people here read Henry James?
me.
Yeah, it's like 4 hands. You know, don't worry, in the UK they didn't read him at all. At all.
Which is your favorite Henry James?
Well, I really love Washington Square, which was his least favorite.
Okay.
But anyway, okay, so, God, now I'm really sweating. So, books that I really love.
So am I.
I do. I'd have to tell you, I do really love this book. I don't know why this suddenly popped into my mind, by a Flemish author. Oh my God, what the hell is his name? Stefan Hartmann's The Convert. Was that a big book here? Yeah, did you guys read it? Silence. It's really, really wonderful. It's set. It's based on the true story of a young girl in Flanders in the 10th century who runs away with her Jewish boyfriend, and the book's divided between that and the authorial narrative of researching the book, and it feels very relevant. So yes, The Untouchable by John Banville. I mean, these are all going to be contemporary novels. I mean, I love The Buried Giant and Never Let Me Go. I mean, Never Let Me Go, I think, is somewhat in conversation with book 3 of To Paradise. Oh my God.
I think we move to the
Is
next
that good?
question now.
Because you know what? Because this is a terrible question, because as soon as I'm asked, I completely forget everything. But for American authors, I really love Mohsin Hamid too, who wrote Moth Smoke, The Reluctant Fundamentalist, Exit West, How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia. I mean, I love those books too.
Okay.
But thank you. Sorry for the unsatisfying answer.
No, it kind of
Next
is.
next question.
Oh. The mic's being taken away.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
I really enjoyed the books.
Thank you.
My question is about the process of writing a book. I'm very curious about it. How does it feel? Because I can imagine it's quite a spiritual experience to have an idea, to write it down, and to finish it at the end. Does it feel like it's your a story of your own experience, or does it feel for everyone? Yeah.
No, it feels like, well, first you begin by feeling you're in control, and then at some point you hope that you're no longer in control, that you're just really writing things down, you're taking dictation. And then when things are going well, and you feel like you're sailing and you have wind behind you, you just want to stay writing for as long as you can. And then there are long stretches of time in which you just want to throw the whole thing in. And then you get so sick of it, you can't wait to turn it in. So it's less, I wish it were more of a spiritual experience. And it can be at times, but over the long course of it, no. I mean, I had this dream, this recurring dream when I was writing my first book, which took 16 years. And the dream was that I would wake up and I would go to, I literally had this dream. I would go to my computer and it would be magically done, like elves had come and finished the book for me. And there's some sort of very disappointing thing that happens when what's in here you try to translate what's in here and is so shining and perfect to to the screen. Something in that short journey, something really gets lost often. And that's the most frustrating thing. It's not making your characters not do what they want to do or so on. It is that there's something intangible gets lost on the journey itself. So I hope you're not a writer and this hasn't, depressed you. You are a writer. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
It's nice to hear.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes, last question.
Wow, that's some pressure.
Yeah, it is.
Hopefully my question would translate from here to the mic. You mentioned that this book is kind of your, not reckoning, but like your take on what is it to be living in America in the current days as somebody that is kind of becoming an adult in these times. And right now in America, there's work reforms, there's a lot of kind of unrest. Do you have any advice for a young person in modern days, or as to Paradise, kind of like just your encapsulation of your ideas for that?
Listen, I'm glad I'm not young right now, and I'm sorry, that's like not a great answer, but it's very hard because every system and every generation older than you has really failed you. I would say that, I would say don't be bitter and try to take as much pleasure as you can and try to, and I think, you have a difficult, for those of you who have been raised with so much access to news, I think it's important to look at the hard things as much as you can. But I think when you also have to decide what avenues of information to cut off. And I don't mean stop watching the news or stop reading. I mean that you should stop looking at things that are about judging other people's appearances or lives. And as much as you can, you should travel and feel uncomfortable. And I think that is the best. I wish, if you can, and more of you can here than we can in the United States. But the most useful thing that I did as a young person and as a writer was find myself in situations where I felt occasionally unsafe, but often simply confused. And the privilege of getting to do that and the necessity of getting to do that, to watch humans in many different contexts move and talk and think and worry is the best experience a writer can have, and I think also the best thing a young person can do.
Yes, I'm very uncomfortable right now. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. This was a a beautiful closing answer of a beautiful night, I think. So thank you.
Joyce, thank you so much. And thank you to all of you. It was really an honor to see you. And thank you for being so much better than the Brussels audience. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
So many people have told me that Hanya Yanagihara's books have made them cry, that I'm also so happy that we had so much to laugh about this evening. Mostly the Belgians. Thank you, Hanya. Thank you so much, our guest of honor. Thank you, Joyce. Thank you, Maarten. Thank you, New Amsterdam. I am happy to be able to say, and also a little relieved to tell you the truth, that Mohsen Hamid has been to the John Adams twice, including on this actual same stage, and that Michael Cunningham has been to the John Adams 4 times, also to talk about specimen days. Phew. Just a couple brief things for your calendar, upcoming events. We're so delighted to be having upcoming events. On March 23rd, we will be hosting William Drozdiak, who is a journalist and writer on international affairs, also biography of Macron, who of course will be addressing the current crisis in Europe. On April 25th, we are delighted to welcome George Packer back, who will be talking about his book, The Last Great Hope. And the next day, he'll also be on television here in Buitenhof. And on May 19th, another éminence grise of international relations, Michael Ignatieff, will be here to talk about his book on consolation. And I also wanted to point out to you one of the wonderful new initiatives that we were able to develop during the dreadful COVID time, but it did give us time to do something we wanted to do for a long time. We now have a podcast. It's called Bright Minds, and you will be able to hear about half-an-hour versions of many of the speakers who've been at the John Adams through the years, and I would like to ask you to listen to it and subscribe and send us your reactions. Let us know what you think. Now, one last round of applause for our guests before she... So don't let the next book take 16 years. See you back soon. Okay. Thank you, Hanya. And she will be signing in the back of the hall. Suzanne, you can guide Hanya to the signing table. Thank you for joining us. See you soon.